Good morning, friends, and Happy New Year. This is my first video of 2022, and where I left it in 2021 was we were looking forward to having a meetup with Noel Murphy. He's been a filmmaker. You can read about him in the public domain. He's a comedian, and he's worked really hard on giving us some interesting Buckminster Fuller movies. Fuller Future and Bucky Part 2 are the two that I got to see just over the New Year's period. And that was pretty fun. That was pretty worthwhile. Just partly to see all the clips he's put together. Now I'm trying to make this flicker work. There's Noel right there. Okay, but I don't have any video. I don't have any audio. I actually do have a tiny snippet of video, but it doesn't have any audio, so it's not really worth sharing, I don't think. But this is one of a couple or three or four listservs or groups that I'm in involving what? The Tetrahedron. Why do I say that? Because Buckminster Fuller, as you know from this channel, if nowhere else, is the famous futurist and dome guy who also built a whole philosophy around the tetrahedron and a whole critique of culture that were too vested in rectilinear orthodoxies. And he comes up with another geometry side by side with what we're used to in terms of coordinate systems and so on, called the isotropic vector matrix. And a whole philosophy and concentric hierarchy based on the tetrahedron as a unit of volume. And it seems to me a very interesting and unprecedented critique of civilization. You'd think there'd be a lot of conversation and interesting, writing about that whole thesis. But there hasn't been. And there's very, very little secondary literature, even 40 years later. And really, the program is to forget Bucky because he's more kind of just, he popularized the dome. And beyond that, he was kind of a kook. That's really the agenda, really. And you can see from this page on the tetrahedron how that is borne out, how that agenda is prosecuted, and that we don't have anything about Bucky Fuller anywhere on this page about the tetrahedron. Like, let me just go to the top and do Alt F for the search box to pop up somewhere. Looking for it, there it is down at the bottom. And I'm just going to type in Buckminster. See, it turns red. That means there's nothing here. But if you look at, say, popular culture and go up from there, there's a lot of tetrahedron in the culture. It's just the Bucky contribution, Synergetics and so on, isn't part of it. I'd say where we get close is weaponry caltrops, because I sometimes call quadre coordinates or caltrop coordinates. And down here, the 2013 film Oblivion, in that film, the large structure in orbit above the Earth is of a tetrahedron design and referred to as the Tet. Now there I can see, Fuller, who wrote Utopia or Oblivion, a sentence right after that could say, futurist Buckminster Fuller critiqued our culture for, let's see, it was either Utopia or Oblivion, and if we didn't trend more towards the Tet, it would be Oblivion. I don't know. You see, I'm not going to write it myself. I'm not going to blurt in here into this page because I've already written most or a lot of, not most, I don't know, quantifying is tough, but I've written a huge amount of the page on Synergetics, Fuller Synergetics on Wikipedia, and I'm always talking about it on this channel and so on. I think it behooves me to just stay quiet here. I've never tried to touch this page. I think it's not real if I do it, because I'm obviously a partisan, you could say. I'm obviously biased. I've already made up my opinion, but if more people understood what was going on with the Bucky stuff, I think we would see his name finally appear here somewhere. I think it belongs, right? philosophy, Synergetics. Just say Synergetics on that page somewhere. Now, how does it work? How does he try to make his tetrahedron play the role of a unit of volume? And we go back on some of these listservs I'm on into cycling through like the high school level approach that we can take to making that clear. And that's what I've been doing. Now, what we're looking at here is actually on GitHub. And here we have quadray coordinates, or caltrop coordinates, as I was discussing. A vector algebra with 4, we'll call them basis vectors, even though you're going to say they're not all linearly independent. The idea is we don't have to rotate any of them. We can just do linear sums, linear combinations without any negatives, right? In XYZ, you've got your 3 basis vectors, your primary vectors, and then you've got your 3 secondary vectors, your negative vectors. Or you might call them your black vectors, negro vectors. And they do as much work as the positive white vectors, but they don't get credit. They're derivative, they're basis vectors, positive or basis, and the others are not. They're not as elementary. Whereas we've got a nice symmetry here in that all 4 vectors are equally elementary, and we don't need any negative cast to reach all points in space by linear sums. Other interesting things like that, how the tetravolumes fit in. How do we call this our unit of volume, given these are CCP packed spheres. Now, when I start using ordinary jargon as opposed to Fuller's, suddenly it starts to come into focus maybe for people in other walks of life. They say, well, yeah, that does sound interesting, right? Just because I haven't used a Fuller jargon, but I don't think that's an argument for dropping the Fuller jargon at this point. So I'm going to add that probably as a possible project to this coda. That one thing we're hoping is to encourage the culture to acknowledge that there is a missing link here between the tetrahedron page on Wikipedia and the chief philosopher who ran with that further and longer than anyone else, as far as I can tell, right? And that shows, if we do get Bucky mentioned on the tetrahedron Wikipedia page, I think that'll show that we are starting to be more Bucky friendly, right? We're starting to be in a culture that's willing to just calmly discuss in kind of a normal tone of voice whether there's something to his ideas beyond that, geodesic domes are cool. Otherwise, he was kind of kooky, right? I think that's selling him short, really, compared to what we could do and how we could benefit. Because it's we who would benefit in terms of his rhetoric being that of people getting along on the planet, which was going to take some doing. We're going to have to overcome our fantasies. Our beliefs in nation state would have to always be checked and balanced. When they talk about a civil war anymore, what does that mean in a tightly connected planet? Like, can I guess your finger can have a civil war if there's an infection somewhere in your body or some irritation. You can't localize and just look at that one part of your body, but really the planet is one ecosystem, isn't it? One economy. Ecosystem is a better word than economy in a lot of ways, because it takes more into account. Kind of like biosphere is better than climate, because it takes more into account. In any case, the nuts and bolts, the nitty-gritty of how to do synergetics math, I think is really enhanced if you also get into quadratic coordinates, and it's all done for you. It's all in Python, and I'm not saying it's perfect, and I'm not saying I'm the big genius here, because really I think we'd move a lot faster and get a lot further if we could build the subculture a little more. A lot more. I mean, there's a lot of talented people, really talented people, who teamed up with Bucky, but we're still recruiting, even though, he died in '83. We're still recruiting for people who will get it and want to join, and kind of a positive futurism that was not just technocratic. There's a lot of misperceptions about Bucky because of his being associated with technocracy or technocrats, which involves a misunderstanding of his use of the word technology, by which he meant nature, right? If you just look out in the universe and see all the stars and just say the word technology to yourself, that gets you closer to Fuller's use than if you look at something made by humans, like this cup, and say this is technology, but the hand holding it is not. Fuller didn't want us to look at it quite that way. And I guess you could say machinery, but that sounds like a concession. Like, oh, the whole world's a machine. You have conceded that point in the debates. And it's really, language is very malleable. And how about energy process, right? Everything's an energy process. But then the rules that it sticks to, the order that energy doesn't just free to do anything. So there's the tightening of the rules around energy, right? Just like we think of laws. There is that sense of tension of being held in. And so those are the generalized principles, right? What people call laws of nature. Fuller wasn't too keen on the word laws because they're so human. Speaking of which, I'm being a little bit tongue-in-cheek here, fighting with Feds as a dino kingdom to the east and so on. There's a lot of playfulness in my prose based on the fact that in Grunch of Giants, we've really turned over the reins of power to the Grunch, which is supranational. So it sounds globalism, but then if you think of Epcot, there was always the pavilions across the lake. By Epcot, I'm talking about a Disney theme park. And on one side you had Tomorrowland, and on the other side you still had the many ethnic traditions. There's still a reason to be a tourist and to go from A to B, because the world is not homogenous, nor need it become so, right? It's not about achieving a Borg-like uniformity around the world. That's not what desovereignization means. Desovereignization means we can no longer consider world events in isolation. Like, what does neo-Nazism have to do with, it's not just about the Ukraine and neo-Nazis, it's about the US and neo-Nazis. So there's a fighting of fascism, you could say, on both fronts, right? We're fighting against it in Washington, D.C. even, right? In regards to NATO's expansionism. All right, so it's a small world after all, I guess is all I'm saying, which is not really new. But is it small enough that we can make this neural link between the Tetrahedron and Wikipedia and Bucky's philosophy? We've got new math here also, like Piero della Francesca. I've got him in my formulas too, along with some new ones relating to quadrats and so on. So let's get to it. Hope so. In the new year, 2022. Talk to you soon.